At the beginning of World War II, the Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were incorporated into the USSR. The Baltic armies barely put up a fight, but in the years after World War I, they did fight against the Soviets, among others, and prevailed. So why didn't the Baltic people unite in 1940 against Stalin to keep away the Red Peril? Keep watching. The Soviet occupation of the Baltic states started in 1940 and ended in the early 1990s with a brief German occupation during the Second World War. Now, in the intro, I mentioned the Baltic nations secured their independence after World War I by successfully fighting off the Red Army and other foes as well. The Baltic Wars of Independence 1918-1920 were a series of conflicts in which Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania defended their newly declared independence against both Soviet Russia and German forces, among others. Although the Baltic lands had been part of the Russian Empire since the late 18th century, the collapse of imperial rule during the Russian Revolution of 1917 allowed them to establish independent states. After the end of World War I, Soviet Russia launched an offensive in November 1918, aiming to push through the Baltic region and spark a socialist revolution in Germany. By the end of that year, Red Army forces had occupied around 3/4 of Estonia. In early 1919, they captured the capitals of Latvia and Lithuania and advanced as far as the Venta River in Latvia and took control of the northern and eastern parts of Lithuania. Estonia, however, managed to halt the Soviet advance with weapons from the Western Allies, naval support from Britain, and volunteers from Finland. The Estonian army launched a counteroffensive on the 3rd of January 1919, successfully driving the Red Army out of the country. Latvia and Lithuania were in a more difficult position and were forced to depend heavily on German forces, who sought not only to defeat the Bolsheviks but also to establish their own dominance in the region. As a result, the Germans obstructed the formation of fully independent Latvian and Lithuanian national armies. Nevertheless, German units assisted Lithuanian volunteers by halting the Soviet advance in February 1919 and later provided limited support as Lithuanian forces gradually pushed the Red Army back. At the same time, Poland, which was also at war with Soviet Russia, entered Lithuania in March 1919 and captured Vilnius from the Bolsheviks in April. In Latvia, General Rüdiger von der Goltz, commander of the German troops, attempted to turn the country into a base for a new anti-communist German White Russian force and to install governments loyal to Germany. Although his forces captured Riga on the 22nd of May 1919, they were soon defeated by Latvian units. The Germans were forced to withdraw, allowing the Latvian government to regain control of the capital. Refusing to abandon their ambitions, von der Goltz and his forces regrouped in Courland and in July joined the West Russian army led by Colonel Pavel Bermont-Avalov. These guys were also known as the Bermontians. Together, they launched renewed attacks on Riga and northwestern Lithuania, but these operations all failed. By December 15th, 1919, all German forces had finally withdrawn from Latvia and Lithuania. Although the German threat had been eliminated, fighting against the Bolsheviks continued. In August 1919, Lithuanian forces expelled the Red Army from northwestern Lithuania, while in November and December, Estonian troops repelled another Soviet invasion linked to the Red Army operations against anti-Bolshevik Russian forces. Finally, after southeastern Latvia was cleared of Soviet forces, Russia signed a series of peace treaties. Tartu, February 1920, Moscow, July 1920, and Riga, August 1920. Through these agreements, the Soviet government formally recognized the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. During the interwar years. Democracy in the Baltic states collapsed. In Estonia, political stability began to unravel in 1933. Economic crisis, bitter party infighting, and the rise of the far-right VAPS movement pushed the country toward chaos. In March 1934, Prime Minister Konstantin Pats carried out a self-coup. He declared martial law, suspended parliament, and cancelled elections. From that moment on, Pats ruled by decree, backed by General Johan Laidoner. A similar scenario unfolded in Latvia later that same year. In 1934, Prime Minister Karlis Ulmanis seized power in a coup. Political parties were outlawed, parliament dissolved, and Ulmanis began ruling alone with the support of the National Guard. He portrayed his dictatorship as a harmonious national state, but in reality all opposition was silenced. In Lithuania, democracy had already ended earlier. In December 1926, a military coup overthrew the left-wing government and brought Antanas Smetona, leader of the National Union, to power as president. Over the following years, Smetona steadily tightened his grip. Parliament was sidelined, censorship expanded, and opposition parties were also banned. By the 1930s, all three Baltic states were authoritarian and politically vulnerable. Because then came the Hitler-Stalin Pact, better known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Officially, it was a non-aggression treaty. In reality, it contained a secret clause in which the two dictators divided Eastern Europe in so-called spheres of influence. In other words, future occupation zones. The consequences were catastrophic. After Germany completed the conquest of Poland, Nazi terror followed, claiming countless Polish and Polish Jewish lives. East of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line, another nightmare unfolded. People in eastern Poland, the Baltic states, Bessarabia, today's Moldova, northern Bukovina, and Finland were subjected to Soviet repression. Finland managed to inflict heavy losses on the Red Army, but in the end was forced to surrender territory, though it avoided full occupation. In 1940, Stalin moved against the Baltic states. In the autumn of 1939, Moscow had already forced Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to sign so-called mutual assistance treaties, allowing the stationing of Soviet troops and military bases on their soil. Officially, the Baltic states remained independent, but in reality, the Soviets now held a gun to their heads. In June 1940, as Germany overran Western Europe, Stalin issued ultimatums. He demanded even more troops and the replacement of the Baltic governments, accusing them of anti-Soviet activities. Surrounded by Red Army units and abandoned by the outside world, Baltic leaders had no real choice. They gave in. The Red Army occupied the entire region. What followed was a carefully staged farce. Moscow organized people's elections under NKVD supervision, allowing only pro-Soviet candidates to run. The newly formed parliaments then voluntarily requested incorporation into the Soviet Union. In August 1940, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were formally annexed as Soviet republics. The Kremlin presented this as a legal process, but in reality, it was annexation by force, wrapped in paperwork. Soviet rule began immediately and ruthlessly. Moscow launched a sweeping program of Sovietization aimed at destroying political, social, and cultural elites seen as threats to the new regime. State institutions were dismantled, political parties banned, and the economy rapidly nationalized. Censorship was also imposed. Religious organizations came more and more under pressure, and schools and cultural life were reshaped along Soviet lines. The most terrifying aspect was mass deportation. The Soviet Secret Service, the NKVD, carried out mass arrests and deportations on an enormous scale on the night of June 13th to 14th, 1941. The Soviets launched their first major deportation operation in the Baltics, the so-called June deportations. In a single coordinated action, tens of thousands of Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians were dragged from their homes. Think of politicians, officers, intellectuals, business owners, and entire families. Men were often separated and sent to gulag labor camps or executed outright. Women and children were deported to remote settlements in Siberia and Kazakhstan. Conditions were brutal. Hunger, disease, and extreme climate claimed many lives. So how can we explain the lack of Baltic resistance in 1940 compared to the 1918-20 fight for independence? I mean, back then, many Baltic nationalist armies were a hodgepodge of different men and material. But during the Baltic Wars of Independence, the enemy, Bolshevik Russia, was in the middle of a civil war. The Red Army fought on multiple fronts at once against the Whites, Poles, Ukrainians, not to mention internal revolts. In 1940, by contrast, the Baltics faced an industrialized power with millions of troops and sufficient equipment. Do notice that in 1918-20, the Baltics did not fight alone. Germany, despite defeat, still had troops and Freikorps units fighting Bolsheviks in the region. Britain sent naval forces, weapons, and advisors, and Poland fought the Red Army at the same time, tying down many Soviet forces. In 1940, no such alignment existed. Germany and the USSR were temporarily partners under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland was now under occupation, and the Western powers couldn't intervene. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania therefore stood alone. Another important factor was that the post-World War I independence wars happened in a power vacuum. By the time World War I ended, empires had collapsed and borders were undefined. There was no single major power in the area that could impose its will on the rest. In 1940, the opposite was true. Europe was being redivided by great powers, and the Baltics lay directly in the Soviet sphere of influence. Let's not overlook morale. Back in the era, right after World War I, the independence wars were seen as national liberation struggles by many, and thus many volunteers came forward. Societies were mobilized for survival. By 1940, things had radically changed, as the Baltic states were now authoritarian regimes with limited public participation. Therefore, mass mobilization was slower. The political leadership was cautious, and there was fear that resistance would bring much more destruction. In other words, in 1918-20, the Baltic people had much to win. By 1940, they had much to lose. Lastly, the method of takeover was way different. In 1918-20, the Red Army invaded openly and could be fought openly. In 1940, the Soviet Union used ultimatums, legal cover, and staged elections, occupying the countries before a clear shooting war began. Once Soviet troops were already inside the country, effective resistance was next to impossible. You may wonder, since the Baltics had common interests, why didn't they unite against the Soviet threat? Interesting enough, a Baltic Entente did exist and was based on the Treaty of Good Understanding and Cooperation. This was a political agreement between the nations signed in 1934 aimed at coordinating foreign policy and preserving peace through neutrality and diplomatic cooperation. Its core goal was mutual political and diplomatic support, but not military defense. Although ideas for Baltic unity dated back to World War I and all three states secured independence in 1920, deep foreign policy differences delayed cooperation. Only after shifts in European diplomacy in 1934 did the Entente become possible. In practice, the Baltic Entente proved weak and ineffective. It was not a military alliance in the first place. Furthermore, it lacked economic integration and failed to define a common enemy. There was the 1938 Polish-Lithuanian crisis, which further undermined unity, while the continued insistence on neutrality left the Baltic Entente unprepared as World War I came closer and closer. After the Soviets reoccupied the Baltics at the end of World War II, resistance did take place, not in the open, but from the forest. Guerrilla war in the Baltic states by the so-called Forest Brothers continued till well into the 1950s. Actually, I might have missed something. A mass Lithuanian uprising did occur during the Soviet occupation in June 1941. It coincided with the German invasion, Operation Barbarossa. This uprising was known as the June Uprising, and thousands died. It is one of these overlooked chapters of World War II, and it is the stuff I love covering. Subscribe, like, and comment. Oh, and click here for my video on the Lithuanian June Uprising.